Carlos Marcello, the quiet king of Louisiana. He wasn't born in Sicily. He was born in Tunis, French Tunisia, on February 6, 1910, to a Sicilian family chasing a better life under the North African sun. His name was Calogero Minocor, a quiet, watchful boy in a world of heat, dust, and trade. Among the crowded markets of Tunisia, he learned something that would stay with him forever: how to read people without saying a word. Years later, the Minocor family crossed the ocean and settled in Louisiana, in the rougher edges of New Orleans. By his early teens, Calogero, now calling himself Carlos Marcello, was already working on the docks, hauling crates and watching deals being made in whispers. But this wasn't just honest work. He started earning on the side, running errands for local gangsters, small-time racketeers who ruled the back streets of the city. Carlos was sharp, disciplined, and different from the loud ones. He didn't drink much, didn't brag, didn't gamble away his pay. He watched, learned, and kept his mouth shut, a survival code that would one day make him untouchable. This was the time before Prohibition, when the Italian underworld in America was still finding its shape, and the men who could mix brains with muscle were the ones who lasted. As the 1930s rolled in, Marcello had already planted his roots deep. He wasn't just another hustler. He opened a seafood company, a quiet front that gave him steady income, and a perfect cover for moving money, goods, and favors. Behind that business face, he was tied to illegal gambling, slot machines, and bookmaking, all run with military precision. While other mobsters fought for attention, Carlos Marcello built an empire in silence, one handshake and one payoff at a time. Before we dive deeper into his rise, don't forget to like and subscribe to Mob Truth. Welcome to the family, soldier. The rise of Carlos Marcello. By the mid-1930s, Carlos Marcello had already built the kind of respect money couldn't buy. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but everyone knew he had the brains to run one. He began taking control of slot machines and gambling operations across Louisiana. Most men fought with fists. Carlos used politicians and payoffs. He paid attention to the people who signed the permits, not the ones who broke the windows. By the early 1940s, his power reached beyond street corners. He made deals with sheriffs, judges, politicians, and city officials, making sure every coin dropped into a slot machine sent a small echo back to his pocket. In 1947, Marcello was arrested for running an illegal slot machine empire. Newspapers mocked his height, calling him the little man. But everyone in Louisiana knew the truth. There was nothing small about his power. But the time he spent in prison didn't weaken him. It made him smarter. When he came out, he found that others had been fighting for his territory. He didn't threaten them. He bought them out, one by one, until most of New Orleans' rackets quietly answered to him. That's when he entered the Mafia hierarchy. The local boss, Sam Carolla, saw something in the calm-spoken young man: control, patience, loyalty. When Carolla was deported, Marcello stepped into the void. By the early 1950s, Carlos Marcello was the undisputed boss of the Louisiana underworld. Every shipment, every bet, every nightclub permit, nothing moved without his approval. While other mobsters made headlines in Chicago and New York, Marcello stayed quiet. He didn't need newspaper fame. He had politicians on his payroll and businessmen shaking his hand in daylight. He had become what few gangsters ever managed to be: legitimate on the surface, untouchable underneath. By the early 1960s, Carlos Marcello wasn't just a local boss anymore. He was one of the most powerful crime figures in the American South. His control over Louisiana's gambling, docks, and politics made him untouchable for years. But a new name in Washington was about to change that: Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Kennedy had made it his mission to break the Mafia's hold on America. To him, Carlos Marcello was a symbol of everything wrong, a foreign-born gangster who had outsmarted the law for decades. In April 1961, federal agents suddenly grabbed Marcello outside his New Orleans office, threw him onto a plane, and deported him to Guatemala. He had no warning, no trial, and no documents. Left stranded in the middle of the jungle, surrounded by dense woods, no money, no passport, and no idea where to go. It was a message from Washington: your time is over. But Marcello wasn't the kind of man who stayed down. Within weeks, he found his way back into the United States, slipping quietly across the border and returning to Louisiana as if nothing had happened. When reporters asked how he'd done it, he simply smiled and said, "It's my country." From that moment, the tension between Marcello and the Kennedys never cooled. Many mobsters across America felt betrayed. They believed the underworld had quietly helped the Kennedys gain influence, expecting protection afterward. Instead, the new administration turned its guns on them. Then, in November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Marcello's name would later surface in countless theories, investigations, and reports, but none ever proved he had any role in it. He was questioned, watched, and followed for years, yet he was never charged in connection with the tragedy. To Marcello, it was simple. He survived again. The Kennedys were gone, but the little man still ruled Louisiana, quiet, calculating, and untouchable. After Kennedy's death, the air in Louisiana felt different. The pressure that once crushed Carlos Marcello suddenly disappeared, like someone had lifted a hand off his throat. Within months, he was back in business. The docks, the bars, the slot machines, all of it quietly returned to his control. The same politicians and judges who once avoided his calls were now shaking his hand again. Marcello didn't celebrate. He moved slow, careful, just as he always had. He rebuilt his empire not through gunfire or fear, but through loyalty, silence, and envelopes that changed hands behind closed doors. He knew the game better than anyone. In the South, power didn't come from headlines. It came from handshakes, federal pressure. But the FBI never really forgot about Carlos Marcello. Even as the years passed, his name kept showing up in secret reports, in wiretaps, in whispered conversations inside Washington, D.C. By the late 1970s, a new generation of agents wanted to finish what the Kennedys had started. Their answer was Operation Brilab, a deep federal sting that targeted corruption between businessmen, politicians, and organized crime. Marcello thought he was untouchable, but hidden microphones and undercover deals finally trapped him. Bribery, insurance schemes, political payoffs. They had him on tape, talking like the boss he'd always been. When the arrest came, the FBI called it a victory against the old Mafia South. But for Marcello, it wasn't the end. Just the moment the walls finally began to close. The 1970s brought a different kind of storm. The old ways, payoffs, silence, respect, no longer worked. The FBI was watching closer than ever, and Carlos Marcello's shadow over Louisiana was beginning to fade. Federal agent Joseph T. Finley led Operation Brilab, a quiet but deadly investigation aimed at corruption and political bribery. For years, Marcello had slipped through every trap. This time, the walls were closing in. Wiretaps, secret meetings, and long nights of surveillance. Every move was recorded, every whisper traced back to him. When the feds moved in, Marcello was calm. He'd been arrested before, but this time, the look in his eyes said it all. He knew it was over. In 1981, he was convicted of conspiracy and bribery. The man who once ruled New Orleans from the shadows was now walking prison corridors in silence, an old lion behind bars. When he was finally released, the world had changed. His allies were gone, his power erased. He returned to Louisiana, not as the king of the bayou, but as a tired old man, carrying nothing but memories and regret. By the time he died in 1993, Carlos Marcello had outlived most of his enemies, but not his legend. Final years. After prison, Carlos Marcello returned quietly to his estate outside New Orleans. The once mighty boss who moved politicians and policemen like chess pieces now spent his mornings feeding pigeons and reading the paper. He was a man watching the world forget him. The underworld he built was changing. New players, new rules, no respect for the old code. Marcello's empire had turned to dust, and his body was giving in too. A stroke left him weakened, his voice softer, his mind drifting back to the docks where it all began. He'd been called many things: businessman, racketeer, kingpin, patriot, villain. But in his final days, only one thing mattered. Survival had a price, and he had paid it. Carlos Marcello died in 1993 at his home in Metairie, Louisiana. No grand funeral, no parade, just a few family members, some old faces from the streets, and silence. The man who once ruled the Gulf Coast from the shadows slipped into history, leaving behind whispers, files, and unanswered questions. His story ends where it began, under the southern sky of Louisiana, where power fades and legends rest. But the name Carlos Marcello still echoes through history, a reminder that even the most powerful men can be brought down by time itself. If you've made it this far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mob Truth. Every new soldier is welcome to the family. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loyal, and remember, the truth always finds its way to the surface.